All right, welcome back, folks. It's day 39. As per the Duolingo tradition, keeping the streak alive. Once again, MAKU desu, konnichiwa, yokoso. So, yesterday we had a lot of discussions, so there wasn't much to recall other than the vocabulary we already have. So instead of that, we're going to talk about the discussions. Yesterday I talked about the whole, a discussion from the previous day about iru, iku, iru, kiru, kuru, sorry. Iku, kuru, and feelings, right? Now I got another story I was inspired off yesterday. This is related to Japanese and some, I guess, nuances that I have learned in the process. Much like having a natural discussion with other people, I think, in my opinion, for myself, I learn and am motivated when discussions come up. So as much as I like to continue drilling myself in the Duolingo fashion, Duolingo giveth and I taketh, so to speak. And in advance, I want to use a phrase that Lotus told me yesterday to thank someone implicitly in the third person in the future if they ever see this, because with all due respect, this is at their expense a little bit. So what was the phrase? Oshiete kurete arigato, indeed. All right, so let's do our story. And boy, there's some stuff to unpack. There are twists and turns, parts of the point where it's then when I screwed up. So let's go with it. So yesterday we had a discussion regarding two other quote-unquote, yet again, of course, this is the theme of Duolingo, but I think there are some prejudices here to unpack. Not for bad or good, just some observations, neutral observations. So once again, we're delving into the nuances, right? The nuances. And a lot of times I do feel this word nuance has been used by my fellow language learners from a place of knowledge, right? And often this place of knowledge is from the Japanese perspective, the Japanese language perspective. And as much as I said it repeatedly, I really appreciate that, because I do not have knowledge of the Japanese perspective. Even as a second language, I do not have that. However, I also, for me, my nuance comes from the knowledge of the English perspective. In my opinion, humbly so, right? So this is where it's quite entertaining, in my opinion, where a lot of the Duolingo time actually get invested, is the idea that if you're thinking from the perspective of Japanese to English versus English to Japanese, the idea of priorities and how to communicate is a little bit different. And this is a great example of it, and it will be a wonderful way for me to remember these things. So now we're talking about, and also as a disclaimer, we're doing some disclaimers. This is 5 hours in one evening, prompted to inspire me to look down this rabbit hole, right? And yes, this is in response, inspired to the idea that, I am not ready for this. And that's fair. I'm not ready for this. For sure. However, when someone tells me that there's too many nuance, obviously I run towards it. Totally makes sense, right? I run towards it. Makes sense, I'm being sarcastic. some people would accept it, tolerate it, and wait and be a little bit impatient, or be a little bit patient. In this case, I'm not really that patient. However, I'm also not looking to set the world on fire and offer more of a non-comprehensive tentative, tentative take. And this is more of a vlog diary, I suppose, to myself about where I will be and maybe reflect upon it down the line. So right now, this is from a 5-hour take, delving into a heavily quote-unquote nuance. There was a joke yesterday made about the nuances of nuances, courtesy of Lotus, and that's what we're talking about here. Learning a language, in my opinion, would be secondary to the appreciation of nuances of nuances. And I am, in my opinion, humbly disagree that there's a barrier to diving into nuances. So for me, of course, naturally, because of this discussion, which I have yet to disclose, I spent 5 hours of my evening diving deep into this, or deep enough to get a better appreciation. And I came up with some interesting things that will probably change in the future. So all of this is tentative, non-comprehensive. So let's talk about the event. So what actually happened? The event of this discussion. In this time, there was some motivations involved. And by motivations, I mean one could interpret it as an argument. And here we go, right? So the event, it was fairly innocent. We had a lot of longer discussions afterwards. However, due to the event of modern technology, right? The nice thing about modern technology is oftentimes you can go back. And this is why I record my sessions and then upload them in 2 different places, right? I can go back and look at timing and how events unfold, right? It's nice to really, while we all have interpretive understanding of what occurs in the moments, it's often nice to be able to have some sort of recording or track of what actually happened, right? And it allows me, at least for myself, this type of review allows me for some catharsis. Not so much for other people. This is more of a selfish thing. I like the feeling that I still have control over my own faculties and my own perceptions, regardless if it's for the sake of educating others or how others view me, right? This is for my own mental selfish protection, as in things that I feel I remember properly, but perhaps I need to pay more attention on how forgetful I am, right? This turned out to be more the former. My faculties are in control rather than the latter. However, there was a misunderstanding. There's all the whole like trailer. This kind of feels like a trailer bait for intense story here. I'm gonna set myself up for an hour and a half, right? Maybe an hour and a half. I think I have enough material for an hour and a half for this. And it's gonna drill me in this concept. I don't think I am going to mess up these Japanese concepts because of this story. So let's do the play-by-play event, right? So this deals with the nuance of usage of aru and iru. Okay? And this was sparked by aru and iru. However, we'll throw in some stuff from my some teasers from my 5-hour talk. There was mention of I think it's more accurately to say shi shoyu, soyu suru, and also motsu, along with what we know, the no particle, right? But it's largely about aru and iru. 5 hour, you can get a lot of information and all of it is inclusive. I don't think there's a lot of conflicting issues about aru and iru. So naturally, to really appreciate the nuance of nuance, it's all of the above. So there's a hot take already here. It's all of the above. That's usually how I go about it. You take it all in. It's not about destructive, as in, oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't remember this, you should forget this. No, it's all contextualized. Let's be Japanese people and contextualize all of this, right? Actually, I more want to say, let's be scholars and learners and contextualize all of these. Problems are problems, but they're not meant to be ignored or forgotten. Confusion and pragmatism and overlapping mechanics are not to be forgotten. It's there as a reminder to contextualize things. So here we go. At some point, I think the particular point of divergence was the idea that my colleague in, thank you Indy for everything. So my colleague mentioned or was describing from my question in Japanese, what did the person observe during their walk? And a dog came up, right? Inu. So eventually it led to my asking, or an attempt to ask, what kind of dog is it, right? And at first I was thinking, oh yeah, so this, I can't actually say this with full confidence. So I took a leap. I kind of remembered something on and then Duolingo did provide this. Duolingo did provide a context for what kind of things. And that was the phrase, or that was the key vocab word was dona, okay? Dona. And the reason why I remember this is because it kind of reminds me of donut. But that's a different story. So when I thought about this phrase, what kind of dog is it, right? You know where this is going because we've already primed for aru and iru, right? The state of being, like to be, right? The state of being or existence comes into question. Now, when I was brainstorming, I was thinking, what is that phrase? And then Lotus popped in and helped me remember the phrase. It was dona. So, na. And I was thinking, how was the context of Duolingo introducing this thing? And I remember, the only parts that I remember were dona, something, right? The thing. Another thing, which I don't remember, which will be revealed later. So this turned out to be, I think, a noun or object, right? And then deska is the exact format that Duolingo used. Not dona object question mark deska. And this is the nuance and nuance. It's important to know the context that I remembered this in. It's in the form of a question. And I might actually even think this is a question mark. It did not come to me at the time. There is a chance there's a ga here. Okay? There might be a ga here. I'm not sure if they went between ga and wa, but that wasn't what my thought was. The most important thing is I suggested a deska. at that moment. And when I mean by suggested, I mean I'm guessing, right? I'm proposing, oh yeah, maybe you could say something like this. Meanwhile, due to the limitations of Twitch chat and how asynchronous Twitch chat is, my colleague and pal, my colleague in the battlefield, wrote 2 responses or 2 chat things, and it wasn't, and this is where I've done screwed up. This is what explains what happens, the point of conflict afterwards. And it kind of brings a smile to my face because it just tells me something that I don't do really well when it comes to reading asynchronous chat with speaking as a streamer, right? So it's an innocent mistake or miscommunication. So when I said this, I think I said something like Dona inu wa desu ka, right? That's obviously now after 5 hours, that's not how that phrase works. However, Indy provided 2 things. Now, this is where the miscommunication happened. So he wrote out what I said, and or wrote out something using a phrase of arimasu. So something like dona wa, I don't know where the wa is at the moment, but dona wa inu o arimasu. Something like that, right? So what kind of dog you have with arimasu. So when these phrases, these 2 messages showed up, it's the first one, and then there's a big or, the rest of the phrase in arimasu. I read this. So I read this phrase, and I thought, oh, hey, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I see where you're going with that. Like, have what kind of dog, what kind of dog the owner have, right? And that is where, in my opinion, obviously, the train falls off the rails. Because my thought process was, I don't know enough if that works. And I thought that was a suggestion of how to express what kind of dog that person has. Because I was thinking what kind of dog that person have, right? So naturally, this, upon reflection, Indy was trying to ask me, did I mean to say this, which is the dona wa inu desu ka, right? Dona wa inu desu ka, or something like that. Or did I say, or was I saying dona wa inu orimasu ka, like orimasu ka, arimasu ka. So that led to this whole discussion, which was really fruitful and informative, with the twist. There's a big twist, and oftentimes, I mention this quite often, I prefer to be underestimated. Go away. Uh-oh. Oh no. Oh, I didn't realize you can move this thing. Underestimated versus overestimated. And sure enough, this is the case, right? Overestimated. So this is the case. It's too difficult for me to understand. It's too nuanced. You're not ready for it yet. Fair enough. And I'm okay with that, because that's what gets me more information. So the suggestion was, oh yeah, you can't do that, right? You can't aru a dog. It's and also well, first actually I skipped a step. Aru means to exist. That was the point. One point was making. Yeah, that's why it's not about have. It's about to exist. Like, you want to interpret aru as to exist. And obviously, thinking about the nuances, it is established that we both understand that in some cases, the interpretation of to have seems reasonable. And Duolingo does do this, and it's going to get really, really nuanced here. So, for the time being, both of us understood that there are some motivations for Duolingo to use to have as a translation for aru in their lessons. However, the advice is that phrasing everything to mean to exist or to be is very helpful to understand how aru works, right? And then that was the first issue, right? So naturally, I said I wanted to say what kind of dog does that owner have. So the motivation is that when I was reading arimasu, the suggestion, it was implying that I wanted to use it as a possessive. That is where a miscommunication occurred, of which I wasn't explicitly explaining how much I know. So it's not relevant here because we kept plowing forward. So I listened, and my argument when my commentary about when I'm being informed that it means to exist, I acknowledge that yes, it is that. And immediately I said it's both. And in both ways, both Japanese and Japanese to English and English to Japanese. The sentiment and the meaning is contextually both, and it fluctuates back and forth. That 5 hours of digging revealed that is still the case, at least from my limited understanding. So not only does aru usually can be written and translated to an English person as to exist, or there is something, in a location, there is something in very specific cases. And sure enough, going back through the VODs, Duolingo uses it in those specific cases. And this is the nuance of nuance. In those very specific cases, the expression is to be in the presence of something that someone owns. And because of that, the transitive translation of it is that it is of them, as in it belongs to them, which implies having it. Those are all the steps that are skipped, right? Duolingo, one of the things that make using Duolingo so much fun with people who know Japanese as a second language, or even maybe one day I'll get to talk to an educated Japanese person who has the nuance of English as well. It would be really fun because technically there's a lot of steps being skipped, and again, Duo does not explain these things, and that's where the fun is, in my opinion. I actually think the lack of Duo explaining has led me to understand so much more of the Japanese language, because the vagueness and the briskness of Duo's design leaves a lot of questions to be answered. So let's talk about this, right? So this is one of the major topics, so let's move on. So one of the major points right now is the idea that to exist is incredibly helpful from a learning perspective. It removes some confusions. So if you strictly stick to it exists, it removes some contextual confusion later down the road. I'm not about that. This is where me and my colleague, my humble and helpful colleague, we disagree in our methods of understanding things. For me, it means to exist and to have, because unlike being scared of nuances, in my opinion, it's not a deterrence for me. I mean, I would eventually learn it later regardless. So it is both to exist and to have. While to have is unpopular, oh, it is very unpopular. I have to admit. It is more so not as in it's a bad thing, is that this interpretation is far more popular when it comes to learning Japanese. So that's perfectly understandable. When you use to exist and bend all the translations of aru and iru into to exist, it helps you compartmentalize the confusion of possessing and owning, which can be expressed in multiple ways. Of one, Duolingo has introduced the no particle, right? The no particle. And you can rephrase. So I thought of how could I express what type of dog that person have? I could rephrase it using the no particle. Like, is the man's dog, of what breed is the man's dog? Or of what type is the man's dog? So you can use the no particle to modify the dog using the topic marker with man. Okay? And even then, there's some wiggle room here with no. So there's some nuances of no as well. Or, which still doesn't really help this situation, you can delve into the nuances of suru and motsu. But this is beyond the scope of this story, so we're not going to use suru or motsu. No was mentioned briefly once at the end, but I don't think this is relevant as well. Not too relevant. But there was mention of how to express like the man's dog and then phrase it in a different way, right? Momentarily. And this one is more like I mentioned it and then Indy mentions it and I'm like, yes, I just said that. So we're on the same page. So this is not where the story gets interesting. So now this was the first point, and it's from the perspective of learning Japanese, and it's very useful. I agree with Indy wholeheartedly. If you use to exist to compartmentalize yourself from to have, that alleviates confusion. However, in my opinion, it does not alleviate how it's translated and how it's understood by an English person, or even expressed by a Japanese person. Sort of. From my 5-hour gathering, right? This is not comprehensive. I would actually have to talk to Japanese people and see how, in what context. My only use is I listened to conversations because I know a few conversations where aru and iru were used. It's actually quite... There are a lot of situations where aru and iru are commonly used. And oftentimes, it's the form of a question. Especially traveling. Traveling, aru and iru are used a lot. So, from the 5 hours, quite like 30 to an hour, I was listening to how it was used and what they were implying. And there are lots of use cases to remember to translate it as interpreting to have. But not in the same sense of motsu and suru, or even no, right? The rabbit hole. But before then, there's another event that happened afterwards. So the other event, well, this is the first contentious point. So then accusations ran high, just a little bit, where I said, well, you know, the way Duo teaches the pattern, or aru tells me that they know this rule, coming up. And they also know the implicit patterns that specifically has aru, meaning have. And it is very specific. Diving into the VODs, it is very specific. And now I kind of appreciate, but also kind of get a little bit, why'd you do it this way kind of thing. However, I made the implication that Indie is providing advice for me, right? To prevent me from maybe making a confusion thing. I rebutted with a counterpoint. And suggested that what Duolingo, the only Duolingo patterns that I know with aru, cannot confuse, or unlikely, the word I would use is unlikely for me to use aru in that way. As in the way of owning a dog, or owning what I would call an inanimate object, or when the person means exist and not have. To me, when Duolingo introduced a pattern, the patterns they introduce is strongly expressing have. And those are the nuances of nuances. It is actually far more explicit, in my opinion, to have someone, if you told someone, what did you say using this aru? What is the expression that you're trying to make? It's closer to have than to exist. Even if it's pragmatically confusing, right? With suru, motsu, and no being in existence, because it would imply have, would imply possession. And in my thing, I said that Duolingo, well, I wouldn't ever suggest aru in which a man has a dog. And that's where we got into who remembers what happened. And technically both of us were sort of on the mark here, but we were thinking about two different things, and that's where I was pushing back. So Indie suggested that I just did that. As in, the claim is that I just use aru to describe a man owning a dog, to have a dog, like what kind of dog a man have. And that's a misinterpretation of aru, because aru is about existence. There is a dog, right? Or like even then, we haven't gone into the whole animate and versus animate yet. For the time being, one of the rules of aru is that you're talking about what there is, not what they have, as in ownership. And Indy suggested I just did that, but no, I didn't suggest that. I suggested deska, which is not correct either. Like the dona phrase with deska. When I read his suggestion or his question, oh, did you mean to say dona wa inu o arimasu ka? He was asking me a question. But here's the thing about miscommunications. When you're asking how to say a question properly, and then you type it out Are you asking a question or you're making a suggestion? So that's the dudes where my car thing happened, where I interpret as that question as a suggestion. So this is where I threw the pooch, where when he was typing out just the phrase, the whole phrase, inu, the arimaska, right? The arimaska, I thought he was making a suggestion, but he was asking if I said that. So as I'm going forward, I'm like, oh, hey, yeah, that could work, right? That could work. And it turns out like that it's not my idea. And so what happened was, I'm talking about a story that happened yesterday, and it's helping me remember the intricacies and diving into the nuances of aru versus I. So in this case, then I told him like, well, I didn't suggest arimasu to use as a possession, right? A dog too. And then he would suggest, no, you did. Like, and I was like, I rebutted and said, the only reason I said it was because you said it. And sure enough, technically, he did say it, but not as a suggestion, but as a question. And I took it as a suggestion. So then my response made him think that I just suggested arimasu as a possession of an animate object. So what happened here is hilarious, in my opinion. My misunderstanding of asking how to express a question led to Indy suggesting asking what I was saying by writing out the question. So then I took it as a suggestion, of which then Indy thought I was suggesting that question, but I wasn't. I thought he was suggesting that. So what it came down to is a circular argument. This is circular. It went in here, then back here, then back here. It's circular, right? And in the end of the day, I felt it got a little heated, so I ended the cycle. How did that cycle end? The comment was, you are wrong, but it doesn't seem like you will ever accept it. But it seems you won't accept it. So when that message came out, my subtextual understanding is, okay, I'm pushing too hard. I just stop. So then I proceeded to say, okay, try again. And I won't push back. Like, try again. And what we clarified in the end is that exist is very useful. Exist, looking at aru, the use of aru is very useful. And in between that, there was also a discussion of animate and inanimate object. But that's how this particular prong of the argument or the confusion resolved. So in the end, we both came to accept the same thing we already know. I was trying to express that through all of this. Unfortunately, the line of thinking excluded that. I was trying to tell you that I was trying to say that exist and have translations of aru is the nuance of nuance that I already understand. And there is no, I am very, very unlikely to make a suggestion that you would use a man's possession of a dog using aru. It gets even deeper. So it gets even deeper. This is where I want to follow the discussion, but I didn't share what I actually know because I didn't want to push too hard. And that's the idea of the other nuance of adu, and idu. And that's the idea of animate versus inanimate. And in terms of adu, inanimate. In terms of animate, idu. Okay? So that was explained to me. And I don't think we have to go into the intricacies. I think for the most part, after my just cursory, non-comprehensive understanding, right? There are no conflicts here. Animate, idu. Inanimate, adu. And to me, both exist and have in terms of the English implicitness. And these are translations versus transliterations. I don't know that I'm using that word properly. But we're talking the realm of not one-to-one versus one-to-one. Okay? So for me, it's interesting to know that the nuances of how to convey have and exist using adu and idu. That's part of the 5-hour dive that I lost all my sleep in last evening when the stream ended. I went to bed around 6 or 7 a.m. So adu, idu, we know the pragmatic use of it, and then we understand that. Thanks, Randy. So tentatively, we understand that it is very useful, pragmatically, as a usage case, to remember that adu and idu means to exist. Like, you don't want to jump into the nuances of expressing to an English person the idea of have yet. However, Duolingo does do this. Without a doubt, Duolingo does do this. They introduce adu in the context of have and exist almost simultaneously. It's in the same unit, at least the way I'm doing, like the way it's laid out now, right? And obviously, to some people, that the exist and have is not anywhere. There are no grammar points for this. The whole idea of like, oh yeah, we took this logic, so this is the logic, and Duo use these specific examples without explainer. So before we go into animate and inanimate, let's finish off the topic of exist and to have. And it still works with exist. It always works. It is not in the guidebook. So this part that I'm about to say about exist and to have is not in the guidebook. However, if you stick strictly to the pattern of Duolingo, it expresses the correct thing, in my opinion, the implicit nature of trying to bridge the gap between an English speaker. So here's the thing. When does exist become have? And you know, as much as I do, when you're learning Japanese, you love context. And yes, it's context dependent. And the weirdest thing is that Duo only, like when they introduce exist and have, or like to be usage of arimasu, when they had to have, it is the nuanced condition that can be more phrased in, so here's the bridge to get from exist to have. When you have to be, and it is contextualized to be somewhere that is of the topic, it becomes have in the translation. So it skipped a few steps. However, all the situations in which Duolingo translate, at least in my recent memory, we have to review and go through all of it again to see. Like, I literally have to go through all the to my memory, most of the times that arimasu is used as translating, not transliterating, translating into there's a chance I'm using this entirely inappropriately. We'll see. Is translating to have is when it is somewhere of something that belongs to the topic. So a great example would be something like do you or the phrase we don't have a restroom, right? So yeah, this is the stretchiest one. This is the one that is the of my memory from all the practice. This is the loosest one that one could argue you should still phrase this in exist, because it works with exist. It's the closest thing to the exist. It's closer to exist than it is to have, sort of. There are ones that are really obvious, which I'll show you an obvious example, but we don't have a restroom. It would be something with arimasen, right? Arimasen is how it's introduced. However, in the context of it, generally it's talking about where restrooms are located, and it's often located to the location that you're talking about. And in this case, the context is that it is the location's restroom. So we this is where we get into the nuance of English. We means the place's owner. So we don't have a restroom is we as a representation of the location does not have a restroom. So you can also say a restroom does not exist. There is no restroom. There isn't a restroom. Here in a location we represent. So it's skipping a lot of steps. Where and of topic. And the reason why the whole thing about of topic, and I'm saying of topic / subject, because oftentimes the subject is implicit, right? And that's the nuance of nuance. Japanese implies the subject, where English does not, and or like English doesn't rely on implicitness. They use the subject, so we. However, in this case, this is a nuance of English. We can refer to a lot of things. And oftentimes when you ask, do you have a restroom? You're referring to a restroom in the location you are at. So do you have a restroom here in the location? If someone asks, if someone says we don't have a restroom, you don't, in an English nuance sense, you don't say, oh yeah, that McDonald's over there don't have a restroom without specifying it. You're not referring to the McDonald's across like 10 miles away. If you say there a restroom exists as a translation, where? What restroom? There's got to be a restroom in this universe, this world, right? There's got to be a restroom somewhere else. However, I'm specifically expressing, do you have a restroom here? So when you translate something like there exists a restroom, that's not actually, in my opinion, what a Japanese person is expressing to a person who's trying to understand what they're saying. They're saying, is there a restroom here? And one of the expressions in English to communicate that is we don't have a restroom here. So it skipped a lot of steps for sure. And this was the one that leaped really hard. How does this get alleviated? You have ni particle and o particle and ga particle. And in most of the cases, whenever there was a interpretation of have for Duolingo, again, this is not explained anywhere. When you use ni, o, and ga, it's pointing to a lot of things. And oftentimes it associates the possession of something. So, for example, when you're asking, do you have a pencil in your bag? For example, I actually don't know most of these words, but the English translates. So, do you have a pencil in your bag? Right? So, in English, the pencil that exists in your bag belongs to you. And you would use ni contextually. And you would also use your and bag as a topic marker. Or actually, it's your is the topic marker, sorry. And then bag is the object. When you have these things like ga, ni, o, it provides the context in which you are specifically referring to the existence of a pencil that you have. It is in your presence. It exists in the presence of something that someone owns. So naturally, when you're trying to communicate to what they're expressing, from the 5 hours of digging, 5 hours of digging of how people ask, like, oh yeah, do you have this? Do you have that? Oh, there's something there versus there's something there. When you're stating that there's something there, yeah, it works out. Like, there exists something and it's like in the vicinity. For an English speaker, it would suggest it exists in this location, which may be owned by something. It's the topic. The topic, that implicit topic, is the location has that thing, right? And when you start doing ni and ga and o, specifically is ga and ni that Duolingo uses specific, like in these have cases, they do use exist. Like there's a table. So in the house furniture unit, it's completely and almost exclusively talked about as in there exist. Because when you say there's a table in the house, there's a table. And it's normative for citing observations in a house. So when you communicate, hey, look, there's a table. Hey, look, there's a temple. The temple exists. And it's implicit in English that it's in the location that you are saying it is. So that location actually technically owns, it's of the topic of that location in there. However, in that case, it feels natural. However, when it comes to a person, like something that a person owns by transitive, it's often referred to as have. And it's both. So not only does the pencil exist, it exists in something that person owns. So what does that mean? It's more like it's more like the no particle combined with aru and iru. It's someone's thing that the thing is in. So yes, you can still not get confused if you know the nuance of nuances. You can still interpret that aru and iru means something exists in the presence of something else. But if it exists in something that someone owns because of context, you would translate it to an English person as have. And why is this important? In my opinion, is that when someone, you're at a school and someone asks you, hey, do you have time to help me with studying? Right? If I'm a teacher, if someone says, do you have time to help me study? They would use aru. Time is inanimate. We'll get to that in a bit. Time is inanimate, but it's time I own. So it would mean, do you have time to help me study? Not that time exists in my presence. When you say that to an English person, they'll be like, well, yeah, time exists. Are you asking me to use my time to help you study? And the projection of that meaning is that the student is asking you for your time. They would still use aru. So this is the nuance of nuance. Like, no, I do not believe it is helpful. Yet, if you're a beginner, if you're like learning this like myself, it makes absolute sense that my colleague Indy would suggest these things in order for me to learn the language consistently, right? Start understanding that it exists for the time being. That's like a nuance already in itself. And then when you get to the nuance of nuance, I wouldn't ever, in my opinion, now that I understand quite a lot more, to give the impression that a Japanese person is always saying, oh yeah, a pencil just exists in your bag. That's exactly what they're expressing. No, I don't think so. I absolutely disagree. I think they say the pencil exists in your bag, but you also have it. It's in your bag. It's specifically, ideally, they're asking for your pencils, not someone else's pencils. Like, for example, when someone says, do you have a pencil in your bag? There's another implicit subtext here. They're asking, do you have a pencil that belongs to you that you're able to give to me? Kind of thing. It's implying that you can freely give that pencil. They're looking for a pencil that you can freely give, which means you own it. It's specifically, implicitly, contextually asking for a pencil you can freely give, not any pencil in existence. Because you can have pencils that exist in your bag, literally in the English language, that doesn't belong to you. So naturally, an English person, in my opinion, would be like, well, I don't have a pencil that I can give you because it might belong to someone else. Right? If you really want to go into the nuance of technicality, that is probably what the English is actually saying. So in most cases, Japanese people are implying possession, even if it exists in the presence. Like its existence is also there. It has to exist first. Then there's a nuance attachment to whether they're implying they want something that you own, that exists now. And that is awesome. I think that is super cool to explain. Is it absolutely necessary to learn Japanese as a beginner? No, absolutely not. To me, it's absolutely necessary for me to appreciate what I'm actually saying. So, how true is this? Well, it's frequent enough that a lot of Japanese people who explain it in English, they still are very comfortable in saying, oh yeah, we're really talking about like the car, right? For example, what kind, or like the car, it's really difficult to say, oh, the car that exists in your garage, right? So the car that we'll say the car that is in your garage, the car that is in your garage, can also be interpreted as do you does a car exist, or yeah, that's better. Does a car exist in your garage? The intent of the phrase, in my opinion, is do you have a car in the garage? Oops. The program is bugging out. Okay. Oh no! Alright, well, we're gonna move on to anime and object. So the idea is, does a car exist in your garage? That can be how one can interpret arimasu. Like, do you have a non-moving car in your garage? However, the sentiments, in my opinion, is they're asking you, do you have a car in your garage? Like, do you have something that exists that is a car that is in your possession because it's in your garage? I wouldn't go and say the Japanese person isn't implying that the car in your garage is not yours. Like, they immediately assume and contextually that that car does not belong to you. That's in your garage, which can be true. And then in English, when I say I have a car in my garage, there needs to be subtext, because articles are not there either, right? So we have to imply articles as well. If you say I have a car in the garage, that car might not belong to you. You would say I have my car in my garage. So when you're going from English to Japanese and Japanese to English, the intent it's trying to clarify intent, and have is a level above exist. So when you hear someone say aru, and iru, then you have to ask yourself contextually, are they suggesting possession here? Not necessarily are they literally writing possession, which is motsu and suru, right? There are other ways to phrase it. And would they, as Japanese people, rephrase that in that way? The answer to me is yes, they would rephrase it in that way. It's a soft way to implicate possession, and contextually, most of the Duolingo examples suggest that it is yours because of its location and who owns the place that contains the object's existence. And that's the whole idea of implicit topics, right? Or implicit subjects that are missing in Japanese. So that's pretty cool. And then the other one is, let's move on to the next one. The other one is animate versus inanimate. And we talk quite a lot about this too. And I had many thoughts about this. Many thoughts. It came down to the guys told me it's I'm not ready. And I kind of agree, sort of. The reason why I'm not ready is because I didn't explain what I actually know about this rule, the animate and inanimate object, right? So animate, iru, and inanimate, aru. In fact, I know quite a lot about this topic. And guess what? The reason why I do know a lot about this topic is because it is in Duolingo. And sure enough, it's this unit. So Duolingo does explain this. The iru and aru. The downside of the unit, it's in the guidebook, by the way. Spoilers. It's in the guidebook of this. The downside is they largely use aru examples, and not so much iru yet. Not so much. But it is in the guidebook. I actually do look at the guidebook. So the explainer between iru and aru was supposed to be informative. And I didn't have the opportunity to explain that I already know this. However, it's still worth reviewing, right? So even then, to reinforce this, like I said, which was very hard to communicate, Duolingo, I would not likely use aru to describe a dog being possessed or owned by an owner. And that's where that whole thing started. This is going way back to the beginning. Duolingo, even if it doesn't explain all the grammar points and explain some grammar points, generally it would not lead me to use aru as does the owner have a dog. Not only does it tell me not to do that, and it would be iru, the patterns that Duolingo use for have, if you read into it, would not suggest that out as well. They wouldn't use it in this context. They would not give you an example, for example, that lead you to thinking that arimasu can be used for a dog that suggests possession by an owner. Like literally, like figuratively, the translation. They have the only examples of have is in the context that it is in a place or of someone's possession. So something that is possessing the thing this thing exists in. So by transitive, it is likely that it is contextually owned by that person because it's in a location of the subject that's implicit. And most of the time, the implicit subject is I or we. And oftentimes in English, I and we can be nondescript. So it's a nuanced thing, right? It's context specific. We, for example, oftentimes what was a really fun, interesting way of using we, the team. Like, we won yesterday. Well, you weren't in the team. Right? So this is where it kind of, now I remember all this stuff because it's awesome. It's showing that English has nuances that aren't communicated, that are ambiguous, and Japanese people are using certain things that are ambiguous at first, but also are nuanced too, right? So just like the like, for example, that example I used for the garage, I have a car in the garage versus I have my car in the garage. That would suggest that I have my car in a garage that may or may not be owned by me. However, implicitly, if you were to try to flip the script on a Japanese person, you would imply by context that if I have my car in a garage, that garage also belongs to me. Likely. Much like when Japanese people use aru, they're referring to something that is in the presence of something that that person owns. That is the most likely contextual case. However, occasionally it might not be the case, right? So if you want to remove that ambiguity in both English and Japanese, you add particles. But the particles are not in the shape of particles in the same in Japanese. In English, you add participles, things that modify the things, right? You add the ownership. Those are the particles. So I have my car in my garage. In order to modify all things, that implicit topic that Japanese people are, the implicit subject that Japanese people are contextualizing is removed, is explicit in English. So to be extremely explicit, you can say, I have my car in my garage. However, you can strengthen the implicitness, the context in Japanese by saying, this Ken's garage exists a car, or there is a car that exists in Ken's garage, in which Ken has a car, or have a car, sorry. So that's the leap that's implying. So when someone's asking, there's a pencil, does a pencil exist in your bag? They're asking if you have a pencil, of which you probably own and can freely give. If you go up to someone and you say, and you hear that phrase and you suddenly say, oh yeah, you're right, yes, there is a pencil that exists in my bag. That's a loss in translation, in my opinion. So both, it's everything. It's the nuance of nuance. It's fantastic. Oh, and let's talk about some fun stuff that I discovered about animate and inanimate. The reason why it's very important about existence and possession is because aru, there are very specific ones that it's not going to make a lot of sense if you translate it to an English person what their intent is. Time is one. In idea is another one. In object, not using to an object that is not alive but moving. So basically avoiding using aru on an object that is not alive, but moving. So when we come to inanimate, the nuances, they literally mean animate and inanimate, as in, is it moving or not moving? So for example, use aru with plants. So this is the nuance of English and the terminology of English. An inanimate object has an implicit nature of being not alive. Inanimate object has the implicit nature of being alive. So using these terms in itself requires an understanding of nuances. The nuance here is animate and inanimate has contextual understanding in the English language. Animate are often synonymous with living things, and inanimate are often associated with non-living things. However, that is not what is being used. So it's the nuance of nuance. You have to understand that inanimate and animate can be confusing because of living and non-living. In the case of this, the nuance is that aru is referring to something. Iru is often referring to something that's in motion or capable of motion on its own volition, and aru is not, right? However, there are conceptual nuances where it gets a little hairy, where if a bus is moving, you use iru, because there's a driver that's driving the bus. Iru, right? Bus driver. So this is a transitive property. A person that is animate is moving the bus, of which now is animate. Iru. So if you want to apply the same method that I'm suggesting about, if a pencil exists in the presence of something that someone else's own, then naturally you're contextualizing that the pencil belongs to the person because it's in their bag. Usually. And that's the contextual understanding. Much like buses. If there's a little bit of confusion a lot of times when people think about the fringe cases of iru and aru, but transitive property is based on contextual assumptions. When a bus driver drives a bus, it becomes animate because the bus driver itself is animate. That's how I'm interpreting it in order to distinguish how when you use iru and aru with a consistent principle. So if an inanimate object makes something else animate, which the bus driver is the subject oftentimes, and a lot of times it doesn't have to be a bus driver, it could just be he, she, it, which is a subject that is implicit. When a bus moves, then you're implying that someone is moving the bus. Therefore, that implied subject is imparting an animation onto the object, making the use of iru appropriate for a bus that is moving. And that's awesome. A couple of extra steps, but also a lot of fun. I think it was incredibly fun, this specific topic regarding iru, aru, and then maybe using a different turn of phrase, using motsu and suru versus no, was more. The reason why I think this is so interesting is because it's a play on logical systems, right? So like, it's one of those things like, if A imparts meaning on B, right, and B imparts meaning on C, then when you say A imparts meaning on C, you're skipping over B, but you're implying you're implying, or a lot of times in Japanese, you're saying contextually. You're contextualizing. You're contextualizing B. So you can skip from A to C when you're contextualizing enough. And in this case, A could be exist, and C can be have, right? And when you bridge this, you are using context. So how do you contextualize it? Well, in Japanese, you can use things like ni, ga, and specifically ga. Ga is a very specific one that demarcates when you want to translate to have. That most of the examples, whenever they say, oh yeah, it means exist, they usually gravitate towards an example that doesn't have ga. It's more like wa. And sometimes it's not ni in a no. So a lot of times when you have ni into something that has a no, it's implying by transitive property that you have something. So for example, Ken-san knows garage. I don't know how to say garage, so garage. I don't know how to say garage at the moment. Ken-san knows garage ni something, right? Ni car o arimasu, or ga arimasu. Sorry, ga arimasu. So the car is in Ken's garage. Therefore, it's Ken's garage. So Ken has a car in his garage. Right? That's where all the things that Duolingo isn't explaining, however, is becoming very apparent to me because we had this discussion. Without this discussion yesterday, I wouldn't make all the logical points here. And for the animate and inanimate object, right? Animate and inanimate object, it starts with the same two. It's where A, B, and it could be any amount of B. B is infinitely big, like B1, B2, B3, and then where B equals C. And so what you're saying is like a bus driver, right? You can get from a subject, which is animate, for example, and you can approach an inanimate object that becomes animate. And it goes through a lot of steps. And B is all the subject stuff, the contextual subject stuff. B establishes this how, where, when to use iru versus aru when it comes to animate and inanimate object. Right? So a lot of times, like for example, the time example, the fringe case, like time you use aru. Well, figuratively, time actually moves. I'm just saying, time does advances, like figuratively. But to explain it to someone, why aru is using time is that this person doesn't own time. Like literally in that sense. So aru is more, but at the same time, you can accept that time doesn't move. If you're saying time is not alive, all of these have nuances because time technically moves. So what you have to know is nuances of nuances that you can accept as truths. So time doesn't move in Japan, I suppose, and not alive. But then you can also go figurative and literal. Right, figurative and literal. So all of that is understanding that all these words in English have multiple meanings and implicitness. So to be fair for most sides, as a person that's English who also learns Japanese, and as I continue to learn Japanese, both Japanese and English have nuances. However, oftentimes when people learn a language, they are learning specifically and destructively by ignoring the nuances of their own language. In my opinion, in this case, it is from my experience, where it's what the Japanese think, but you're not making it concordant with what you know about English. It's this direction. And for me, I'm doing both. Oops, it's this direction. Like, I'm doing both. So how can you see what they're trying to say? And when someone says aru in time, they are inferring your time, not the time that exists everywhere. Like, time exists for everyone, but you're gonna lose the meaning if you don't understand that that person is saying, do you have time to help me? Not their time, does time exist to help? Well, okay, yeah, time does exist to help. Wait, oh, you're asking me if I have time to help you. Oh, okay. And that's what the great majority of aru is when they have. What's another place that aru was shown up? Do you have hobbies? Do you have any hobbies? Aru is used there because there are hobbies. Hobbies exist everywhere. I'm sure hobbies exist everywhere. But the implicit nature is you're asking the person, do they have hobbies? And hobbies is inanimate, right? So it fills the criteria. Aru, inanimate, and it exists. Hobbies do exist, right? However, the implicit nature of trying to communicate to an English person what does that phrase mean is they're asking you if you have any hobbies, not that there are hobbies that exist. That meaning would be lost. Like, well, yeah, lots of people have hobbies. What do you want to know? So ga is introduced there. It's ga arimasu. At least that's what I remember, to emphasize something. So to me, that's how they're introducing it. The context is often within ni and ga particle when arimasu is used or to translate to have. So just my 2 cents. And just so I can demonstrate, it's been an hour and a half, which is how long I plan on going, just to demonstrate that I'm not, I actually know what I know before the discussion. Unit 6, right? I'm on Unit 6. And you hit the guidebook. Here it is. In English, we say there is a table, or there are tables. In Japanese, you can use the verb arimasu. Keep in mind, nouns in Japanese have the same form, whether you're talking about one thing or many things. In a conversation, you can tell based on context, or it's just not as important, right? So you could say, mada ga arimasu. There is a window. But, and toire wa arimasen. There is no bathroom. These are actually the examples they use for generalized use for exist or to be. The times when they use have, there are gas and ni's phrases that qualify that it's in someone's possession. Okay, so but if you want to say something like there is a cat, you actually need to use imasu instead of arimasu. Arimasu is for inanimate things, while imasu is for people and animals, which is good enough. It's good enough to understand the practical uses of imasu and arimasu. So depending on your level of experience, in my opinion, I love nuances. So give me all the nuances even before I'm ready for them, I suppose. So for this, yes, it would be enough, but the nuance goes deeper. And when it comes to interpretive translation, I would probably interpret it with more than simply saying, arimasu is for inanimate things, because inanimate things would imply they're non-living, but non-living things can become animate. So there is a limitation. And then they say imasu is for people and animals. There are things that can move that are not people and animals, even conceptual things that can move. So that's kind of the nuance of nuances. But in general, much like when someone says, oh, you should try to think of it as just exist. This is what you're doing, in my opinion. Humbly and respectfully, my colleague, thank you for setting me down the line of this. But generally, it means both. Aru and iru means to exist, and with enough context and nuance, it also means to have to an English person. Like when the Japanese person is saying aru, if there's enough context, it actually does mean to have. So it's both. Mechanically, it's helpful if you separate the two, but they're not separable, in my opinion. So there we have it, at least for now. Maybe the definition will get deeper and more engrossed. I have other questions that I couldn't find answers to. So there are some loose answers to even deeper things that I wanted to know. Like, how often is the frequency of literary use, right? Literary use, because something that's imaginative can probably be iru, but not aru. So that's still some. And then there's even more fun stuff, like historically, it has been aru, just aru. There wasn't even iru, right? So there's also that. And if you travel back, so there's some really fun little trivia after diving into aru and iru. And I have not done, I don't know if Duolingo will go into this, but you know, the suru, like a suru mod or a motsu, I have been told by this specific colleague that I'm incredibly grateful for offering information that I can talk about all the time, is the idea of ownership, to own. And it is in Duolingo. I didn't get to it yet though. So it might be motsu, it might not be, it might be some other way, but whatever it is, there's another thing somewhere down the line. But yes, Duolingo does cover animate versus inanimate, and oftentimes that's good enough. And what they're going to offer is that instead of saying have, which I talked about this yesterday, if Duolingo introduces maybe motsu, for example, as own, it's to own. It's not the same as have. That's the nuance of nuance. When someone suggests to me that exist is not have, well, both. Have is to exist. Exist can be to have. Can be. Much like have can also mean to own. So not necessarily the same. So if Duolingo introduces something as to own or to possess, it will, to me, I won't confuse them. However, I can see how others can. So that's fair enough. It is fair that if you keep thinking about it to have, you might end up substituting arimasu for own. However, they told you the one thing that even if you use arimasu, this rule right here, the animate versus inanimate rule, actually supersedes the interpretation of have. So if you use this as the first rule, which Duolingo has, when you're trying to express have or possession, it actually comes off as possession still. As in if your intent is to tell someone I have a pencil in my bag and you use arimasu, there's no loss in there's less communication loss. So like, oh yeah, arima, pencil, the phrase, and then the Japanese person would say, oh, okay, so the pencil is in there and it's likely belongs to you. Right? As opposed to, hey, I'm just telling you, like, this is cool. This pencil is in my bag. Isn't that neat? Versus, oh, there's a temple. And even that has nuance. So when you say there is a temple, you could say des, like you could use it is, right? Right, is, des. And this goes into another deep discussion that I'm not comfortable in sharing at the moment, but it will just extend the time too much. But commonly adu is preferred for the existence thing. Because this sounds abrupt. And why does this sound less abrupt? Because this, it almost feels like it's even broader. Like, oh, okay, that is a temple. Whoa. There's no it's like out of the blue, right? Like, oh yeah, thanks, that is a temple. Versus there is a temple with adu, as in this is a temple that is here in this location, which belongs to this location. So it's more interesting, in my opinion. That's kind of why it is also important to know that adu and iru can mean to have. That's even more interesting than to just exist, in my opinion. So it is necessary to know that, at least in my opinion. If it makes it more complicated, well, nuances. Ironically, it complicates things. Nuances are complicated, and it's fun. I won't ever forget this because of our discussion, right? Yeah. Anyways, now forevermore, iru, adu, even suru, motsu, and no are gonna be rattling around in my head everywhere. And des is something else. Des is a loose thing. I just got to the idea of contrasting between des, adu, and iru. But that's a story for another time. Yeah. There you have it. Right? Fun times. And before I start on my lessons, because it's just at this moment I'm reviewing because I didn't get through the unit 7, I'm going to take a quick bathroom break. I'll be right back.